I'm Shaun Francis. I'm CEO of Medcan and the host of the Eat, Move, Think podcast. And I'm really delighted to have Allison Hazell with me today, our Director of Clinical Innovation, and really the person responsible for Medcan's genetics services for many, many years. And super excited to have her speak about an amazing new initiative that we have where we'll be sequencing the whole genome. So welcome, Allie, to this very special moment for Medcan to discuss a very special service we're about to be able to offer.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here talking about this program. It's been years in the making, and I'm really proud of what we have developed. I'm really excited to be able to give our clients and Canadians an option for high quality, evidence-based whole genome sequencing that's integrated into their healthcare, really allowing us to take prevention to the next level.
You know, you've talked about whole genome sequencing. You've talked about what the genome is, but I think, for the layperson, it's not easily comprehensible. So if you were to back up, talk to us about, what is the genome and why is it important to sequence it?
A potential analogy that can be useful is to think about your whole genome sequence as a super detailed, high quality roadmap that's individualized to you, but it's maybe the size of North America. So it's a huge amount of data that is mapped out for you. And right now we are very good at labeling the map when it comes to major cities and arteries and roadways. We know that there's certain genes that are associated with risks for heart disease or cancer, and we can use that data that from your sequence to be able to predict who's going to be at higher risk for developing certain health conditions or more likely to metabolize drugs differently than normal. What we don't have right now is the ability to necessarily map every single backcountry road or every single small town. And so what we do with your whole genome sequence is essentially have that map available. It's on high quality paper. It's not going to disintegrate over time. And you can go back to that map and update it with the information as we learn more about certain areas. So what we're doing with our Genomic Health Assessment program is basically giving you that high quality map, giving you all the information that you can use right now to manage your own health, and then the ability to go back and update it over time as research advances, technology changes, et cetera.
And so in updating it over, like once you have the map, so to speak, will you need to, give more blood samples, or is it, you have the map and now it's converted into data? And as we learn more about genes, then Medcan can give you more insights.
Exactly. So the goal is that you don't have to go back. You don't have to resequence any of your data. We have that sequence there available. So we have that map printed for you. Our ability to kind of label the map becomes better and better over time. And so, having this information just makes it more efficient. We know that there's certain things that will change in terms of your own health context. And so maybe you want to go back and look at a certain area that wasn't as important when you first did the genome sequence. And so we can do that without needing another blood sample or doing any other genetic testing.
Talk to me about, what is the genome from a, science perspective, not super complicated, but if you could just explain what comprises it.
The whole genome sequence essentially is a read-through of every single letter of your DNA. So we have approximately 3 billion letters. And so it's a technology that will read through and document each of those letters. And that makes up our genes. So we have about 20,000 genes in the body. And then genes are involved in, helping direct your cells to become a hair cell or a skin cell or a muscle cell. Mutations in genes are associated with certain health conditions, so an increased risk for cancer or heart disease, for example. And so essentially with what we're doing with whole genome sequencing is getting the most complete record of your DNA, so that you can use it for your own health and wellness purposes.
So in the context of whole genome, you have the exome in there as well. Is that?
Yeah. So the exome is really describing the sequencing of the genes, where the whole genome is sequencing the genes plus all of the data points in between the genes, which originally we thought was not that important, the spaces in between the genes, but increasingly we're learning that information has value.
And how many genes do we have? Versus you talked about, did you say 3 billion letters?
It's 3 billion letters, about 20,000 genes.
Okay.
And currently we understand what 5,000 of those genes do. So there's a lot of data in there that we don't have a direct link to a particular health risk for, but that's the area we continue to learn more. And so once we have that data documented, as we are able to kind of interpret new pieces of it, we can do that really easily without having to do any additional testing.
So Ali, what will Medcan be offering with the genomic assessment?
So the Genomic Health Assessment combines your whole genome sequence with our annual health assessment. And so basically what we're able to do is take thousands of data points that we collect during the annual health assessment and combine it with the whole genome sequencing data to really provide you with the most complete picture of your health. The way that the program works is the first touch point is always conversation with a genetic counselor, one, to make sure that any questions are answered. You have a good understanding of what the test and program will give you. We do a blood sample that we send to a academic clinical genomics lab, one of the best in the world. And then we do the annual health assessment once we have those results back. And then the follow-up. So based on the data that we get, we can say, for you, it's really important that you're having an ultrasound done of your heart every year. Not something you necessarily would have had done unless you developed chest pain, but for you, that's kind of what we're going to suggest. Or we need to be doing this blood work more regularly just to make sure that we're not getting into a issue with a certain risk with blood results, for example.
And is there a certain client that should definitely do this?
So what we tend to see are people who are early adopters of technology, who are focused on their own health and wellness and wanting to invest in that. We also see a lot of people who are interested in doing whatever they can to manage their health risks. With whole genome sequencing, I think we will also see people who are looking for personal utility in addition to kind of medical utility. And what I mean by that is, there may be information that we come back where we don't have a specific regular screening to offer you based on that health risk, but they may change their lifestyle or some of the decisions they make around retirement by using this information. So those are kind of the generally who we see opting into these things early. And then the other big area is people who are wanting information that can be useful for their children and grandkids. And so making the investment for themselves, but actually their primary motivation is really to give their kids information that could potentially be valuable for them.
How many years ago was it that we did map the first human genome? It doesn't feel like it was that long ago.
So it was 2003 officially that the first complete human genome was sequenced. It took about 10 years and millions and millions of dollars to do. And over time, if you look at sort of the graphs in terms of the efficiency and cost effectiveness of doing this, it's been pretty exponential in terms of our advancements. What has also changed is as we're able to do sequencing more efficiently and effectively for people, more people are doing it. A lot of this has been under kind of a research umbrella, but the more genomes you have, the better you are able to interpret the data. So we need a lot of reference genomes to be able to say, okay, this is something that's pretty standard. It's a benign genetic variant. It doesn't really mean anything for somebody's health, versus this is a genetic change that actually is going to have a big impact on your risk.
So when we hear of 23andMe or Ancestry.com, for example,
they're actually not doing sequencing. They're not actually reading through the entire gene. They're just picking out certain locations and looking at that single letter. So it's a pretty different process in terms of comprehensiveness and having a record of your genetic data.
So explain that. So if I give a sample, right? I think in their case it might be saliva. Yeah. They're not actually then mapping my genome. Is that right?
No. Yeah, they're not mapping your genome.
They're taking bits of DNA to match against insights they already have. Is that right?
Yeah. So they're basically looking at, certain spots in your DNA and comparing it to what would be considered standard. And so saying you're, if we're thinking about hair type or eye color, they're able to say, okay, this is the letter in the code that's most commonly associated with blue eyes versus brown eyes, for example. It's more complicated than that because it's not just a single letter that influences traits. So it's looking at a bunch of different spots in your genome simultaneously to kind of give you some information and insight.
And so for them to do that, they don't have to retain your entire genome. They're just putting a spotlight on certain parts of it.
Yeah. So in terms of the technology that's used and the data that's collected, it's pretty sort of a drop in the bucket in comparison to a whole genome sequence.
And talk to us, it's sort of a bit of an aside, but I know that Ancestry.com and some of these other ancestry databases, they appear to keep your data, and they've been using that, I know, in criminal cases to solve long-standing cold cases. So how does that work?
What you're getting at is some of the kind of privacy and security around data, genomic data in particular. Essentially, what we're hearing with like the Golden State Killer, for example, that was found through some of these ancestry type databases I don't know if it was necessarily a commercial lab like Ancestry.com, but there is a lot of kind of citizen science public databases out there where people were uploading their genome and finding relatives and things like that. And so that's really what that is linked to. We do know also there may be, ability to for law enforcement to require a commercial lab to give genetic data. One of the things that we hear from our clients is concerns about privacy and people selling their data to third parties for profit. And so with the Genomic Health Assessment, when we went out to find a vendor for whole genome sequencing, one of the things that we really kind of put a stake in the ground on was that we did want a Canadian partner, essentially so that all data and samples are kept in Canada. And the vendor that we ended up with is not commercial in nature. So your data is not going to be sold to a third party. It's really to be used for you and by you to give you the information about your health.
So Ali, I know just sort of reading up on some of the stuff you've been involved with, one of them was the Personal Genome Project Canada. So can you tell our listeners what that was about?
Yeah, so that's it's a large-scale research study. It started in 2010. Basically taking healthy individuals and doing whole genome sequencing on healthy individuals. Essentially, the goal was to understand how valuable this can be in a healthy population. So traditionally, genetic testing and whole genome sequencing has been done for diagnostic purposes. So in rare diseases, a child who has a very kind of rare condition, they can't really figure out what's going on, or somebody who has a very significant collection of symptoms that we can't kind of pin down. With the Personal Genome Project, it's really flipping that and looking at healthy individuals and how we can use this data to optimize health. Medcan, since the beginning, has been donating genetic counseling in kind to the project. And so in my capacity, I've been meeting with research participants to review their whole genome sequence, which has been a really interesting and enlightening process for me. And I think that experience has really shaped how we have how we've designed our whole genome sequencing program. So one of the big things with that project is that it's a really very in-depth, busy report that you get back. It's really overwhelming for the participants. You get a lot of noise and data that may not be useful. And so for example, one of the things that we've chosen to do is give people only the information that is well-known, well-validated, actionable.
So, Ali, tell me about the people you actually counseled as a consequence of the Personal Genome Project, and what were some of the most impactful scenarios in terms of health outcomes?
Yeah, so I think a general theme with the research participants in those counseling sessions, one is that it's a lot of information. And so I think having somebody to help distill it down is incredibly important. And to me, a takeaway is that actually then having somebody to help you action that information is equally important. So it's cool to have the information, but if you can't really do anything about it, or there's no pathway for you to take action on it, then there's kind of limited value to an individual. The other big piece from that project is looking at the data in aggregate. So in 2018, we published the data on the first 56 participants. And what was found is about 25% of people had some type of health risk that would impact their health in some way. And every single participant had information that could be used, if not for themselves, for their offspring, could have impacts related to medication response and that sort of thing. So the overall kind of general summary is that it's going to give you, whole genome sequencing will give healthy individuals interesting, valuable information.
And what was the of those participants, or frankly of any counseling you've done on someone's genome, were there a few that come to mind that were the most impactful in terms of like changing your behavior and or course correcting a potentially negative health outcome?
Yeah, so I think the most interesting cases I've been involved in have actually been in terms of the Medcan genetics program. So we've done genetic testing and proactive purposes for years, and we've talked to over 10,000 people about what they're interested in learning about, and how they will plan to interact with this information. And we've had a number of cases where we've identified a risk that's changed somebody's medical management significantly. So, they've learned that they're actually at a much higher risk for ovarian cancer, for example. And because they are no longer, their family planning is done, or they may have already gone through menopause, they can have ovaries removed and kind of actively prevent that cancer from developing. Or from a cardiac perspective, having a cardiac risk that they otherwise wouldn't have known about unless there was a sudden cardiac event. And so we're really able to change the course of that person's life in terms of giving this information up front so that they can use it proactively.
So, Ali, I've had my own whole genome sequenced and had some interesting insights, one of which was I carry a recessive gene for muscular dystrophy, which means that in this case, I don't have it. My sons don't have it because my wife doesn't carry the same gene. So could you talk a bit about the science behind that?
Yeah. So basically with a risk like that, it's interesting to you. It's not going to impact your own health, but it could affect your kids if your partner, if their mom has the same gene mutation.
And so let's dig into that a little bit then. So is it possible my kids will have that recessive gene now?
Yeah, so each of your kids have a 50% chance to carry that same mutation that was identified in you. And so it could have impacts for their kids, again, if they have a child with someone who also has a mutation in the same gene.
And does that mean then that they ought to be asking their partners at some point before they have kids if they have this gene, or does it affect that at all in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think there's something called universal carrier screening, and it's an example of kind of a more targeted test, just looking at these recessive conditions that can impact people in infancy, essentially. That is becoming more common, but it's still not mainstream. But that's an example of something that couples will often do before they have kids, just to make sure that there isn't any risk underlying there that they wouldn't have known about otherwise.
And then if you, so let's say my wife in this example had that recessive gene, is it a certainty our kids would have muscular dystrophy?
It would be a 25% chance
25%
with each
chance.
pregnancy.
Each pregnancy. Like, how prevalent are these conditions that it might influence how we go about having families in 20 years?
Generally speaking, everybody is a carrier for something. We think everybody's a carrier for probably between 3 and 10 of these autosomal recessive conditions. The reason why they're rare is that, the having mutation in one of these genes, you need to have a child with someone who has a mutation in the same gene. So it's just kind of a chance probability thing. But it's an important point in terms of our clients and what reasons why people would seek out genetic testing in general. Is one, for their own health, but also to be able to give information that could be valuable to their kids and grandkids. It's something that we're seeing more and more in terms of people actually acting on that, because it can, our genes will run through families. So what you find out about yourself will have impacts more broadly than just you.
Another insight from my genome sequencing is on the pharmacogenomics side, which is I appear to metabolize codeine more rapidly. I don't know, even with that insight, like more rapid than whom? Like, is it, I don't know what percent, am I top 1% metabolizer, or, is it 50-50, and how, what's fast versus not fast? And then why is that important? So could you talk to our listeners about that?
Yeah, so I think different, the field of pharmacogenomics is really looking at what versions of the genes that you have, because it can impact how quickly or slowly you metabolize a drug. And that can impact whether the drug is effective for you. It can impact risks for side effects. So in terms of codeine, essentially it's complicated for certain medications. We'll go through multiple genetic pathways, but to simplify it, if you think about codeine, so it's a CYP2D6 gene that impacts or metabolizes codeine. There is a standard form of that gene. And so that likely, because it's the most common, and I don't know necessarily the numbers, but let's say 75% of people have that kind of standard version. When they were doing medications and creating the dosage guidelines, et cetera, it was based on people who are going to metabolize that drug normally. If we know that you're in 5% of people who metabolize codeine more quickly, or you have a fast metabolizing version of the gene, then we can say, okay, the regular dosing guidelines don't apply to you because you're going to metabolize this drug differently. And if you are just given the standard dose, you may be at risk for a side effect down the road. So that's kind of how the pharmacogenomics piece works. It's super interesting, particularly in mental health, wellness, and pain management space, although we know cardiovascular medications can come into it. So yeah, it's a really interesting aspect of your genome that can be really useful.
And what are some other typical drug insights that are seen relatively frequently?
Yeah, so the biggest area that we see impacts are in mental health medications. So anxiety, depression medications, SSRIs, these are drugs that typically have a high level of kind of genetic metabolism involved. There's other medications, like we get a lot of questions about Synthroid, for example, which actually doesn't go through a metabolic pathway. So it's important to kind of understand that there's different medications your genes will have different impact on different medications, but at a high level, where we're seeing the biggest impact right now is in mental health medications.
And is that meaning helping you determine which antidepressant to go on?
Yeah, exactly. So which one to choose, or also the dose to be on. So right now it's a lot of trial and error. You go back and forth, you try one medication. Different physicians have different strategies that they use. They start with drug X, and if it doesn't work, they increase the dose. And if that doesn't work, they go to drug Y. So the pharmacogenomics data is really a way to say, based on how I'm going to individually metabolize this, let's start with drug Y right away and avoid that whole process of testing out another medication first.
Do doctors know this? Because I feel like they're still in the trial and error era.
I think this will be mainstream eventually, but there's lots of other things that can impact drug metabolism as well. So one of the things that, a physician will say, I wouldn't just use this report. I'm going to take into account their history of chronic disease and their weight and their smoking status, and all of those things come into play as well. So I think what is going to augment this field is really helping people understand how to use this data in conjunction with the other data points. And there's a lot of work being done in that. And I think it will be, again, in the next 5 years, I think it will be mainstream.
Meaning mainstream, like everyone would want to have their genome sequenced and to know this information in advance of a prescription for most drugs.
Yeah, so in terms of the pharmacogenomic testing specifically, so again, it's one piece of the genome.
Yeah.
In terms of whole genome sequencing, it's an example of how you're able to get all this data up front and then use it in different ways throughout your life. So because you've had your whole genome sequencing done, when you're being prescribed a medication, you don't have to have a pharmacogenomic test because we already have that data for you and we can use it in that scenario. So the idea with whole genome sequencing is really that you're sequencing once and then interpreting and using it often in different scenarios based on context and need.
I've read, Allison, that because this is a new science, the breadth of data that we have of whole genomes is not that diverse because it's only affordable to certain people so far. What are the implications of that, and will that change?
We know a lot more on how to interpret the data of people of European ancestry than from other ethnicities. And so it doesn't mean that the information isn't valuable for people of all ethnicities, but we're more likely to come up with genetic information in non-European populations that we aren't able to interpret. And so one of the kind of big pushes we're seeing broadly in the field is to increase the diversity of our genomic databases, which I think is a hugely important task and will benefit everybody. So, over the years, we've contributed to research projects. We've had conversations with people about donating genetic counseling services in kind to these sorts of projects and programs, and something that, as a team, we're aware of and want to help as much as possible.
Should someone be worried about how this might impact their ability to get insurance at a later point, be it health insurance or life insurance?
So it's a great question. In 2017, the federal government passed the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which is a federal law essentially that prohibits anyone entering into a contract, so employers or insurers, from using genetic information in a discriminatory way. And this is really important because we've had countless conversations with people who are interested in getting this information and want to be proactive about their health, but choose not to do it because of fear of having their premiums go up, for example. And so the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act has really kind of removed that issue. It was challenged by a few industries and upheld by the Supreme Court in 2020.
How does that differ from the U.S.?
We actually kind of leaped over what the U.S. had. The U.S. has a genetic insurance non-discrimination act it's in place, but it's not as broad as kind of what we have in Canada. So I think our protection is is one of the greatest in the G7 countries.
So, Ali, what does whole genome sequencing mean for the future of personalized medicine?
So I think it's the foundation of our ability to practice personalized health or precision health. It will influence everything from your annual screenings and your primary kind of day-to-day care, what medications are prescribed to you, potentially what type of diet you follow. So it's, I think it's not the end of this story. I think we're going to continue to see genomic advances, but it's the foundation that everything else will build upon.
What is epigenetics versus genetics?
I think epigenetics is kind of the next layer that we're really going to see transform healthcare. So basically, with your whole genome, there's certain ways that the environment will interact with your genes. So if you're a smoker, for example, we know that impacts your genes by either turning them on or off. It's something called methylation. And so with epigenetics, what we're anxiously awaiting being able to do effectively, and I think we're still a bit early, but it's coming, is to be able to look at the impact that your lifestyle, your environment is having on your genes, and whether that they've been turned on or turned off with those lifestyle factors.
But it's not quite there yet.
It's not quite there yet. It's one of the things that is waiting in the wings.
Mm-hmm.
But our ability to do that well and effectively on a broad scale is not ready for prime time.
Right. And the science isn't quite, because you hear of people offering that, but it may not be totally reliable information at the moment.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you, Ali, for joining us. And it's super exciting finally to be offering whole genome sequencing. We've been in the business of offering genetic insights to our clients for at least 10 years, if not longer.
I think the program was established in 2005, and we've been offering genetic testing since 2008.
Yeah, so quite some time. So we've been an early pioneer in that, really since the human genome was mapped, as you said, in 2003. So, Medcan's always been on the forefront of it, and it's super exciting to now be at the point at which we will be mapping the whole genome and doing that hopefully for all of our clients. But I imagine at some point every Medcan customer will have their genome sequenced, and it'll be just part of that. As opposed to doing the family history, we'll be looking at your genome in that physician-patient discussion and offering insights, based on that, which could be life-altering. So it's really when we talked about personalized medicine, there's nothing more personalized than having all of your genetic insights road-mapped for you. Anyway, thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for joining the Eat, Move, Think podcast.
Thanks for having me.